Good morning. We're out here demonstrating the proper way of pruning grapevines. This is a relatively younger block of Chardonnay in the Yountville area. And one of the main things that experienced pruners need to look at is how the vine grew for the year and try to prune appropriately. And what we mean by that is look to see if we've got long canes that are 2 to 3 feet long, like here and here. If we have weaker ones, to prune them down to one position, one bud, and I'll show you what that means in a second, as well as making good selections and maybe opening up where things are too crowded. And in wine grapes, we like to look for our canes to be upright as much as possible, not horizontal. This would be okay in table grapes or something out like this, but we would like to always look for something that's going upright because we're going to use these wires to contain the foliage as it grows through the next year. So I see that we had a couple of weak positions right here. This is the first bud and this is the second bud, so that's where we would normally prune, would be to 2 bud spurs. For example, if this was a 2 bud spur last year with our basal bud here that got suckered off in the spring, our first bud push and our second bud push. Thank goodness that we don't really need this upper position, because we always like to try to lower down and keep our arms and spurs pretty uniform across the cordons. So I would go ahead and prune this to 2 buds there and 2 buds here and remove that, as we talked about. Get this going a little bit horizontal. Again, the same treatment for this one. I would just take this out. We're trying to look for approximately a hand space between our spur positions, and then this was an extension already. Here, because it's very small in growth, we don't want to completely eliminate it, we'll cut them to very small 1 bud positions. Same thing here, and take this one off down here, and removing the canes off the wires, such as that. Again, on this side of the vine, we have about 6 nice positioned spurs, and typically we want to remove the last year's wood and bring it down to this position here. Same thing here and here. So I'll go ahead and demonstrate that. Mind you, the shears are very sharp. They cut through this dormant hardwood pretty easy. In this case, because this is going more horizontal and this is vertical, I'm going to opt to go ahead and leave this and take this one off. And notice that when I go and make my cuts, I always try to put the flat side of the shear up against the wood that we're going to retain, the flat side being where the blade and the anvil come together, and we make a nice straight cut. And if we have to rotate the shear in our hand, we can do that. Because if we do not do that, this little space here where the anvil is, that's how much we're going to leave on top of our cordons, which leads to a lot of other problems later on. So we always try to utilize and rotate the hand if we can, and make the nice cuts on the flat side. Again, we're going to remove this lower one because it's going horizontal, because we want to try to keep all our cordon positions as upright as possible. So again, we're looking at our hand width space between our spurs, more or less. That's ideal. And you can see again on this side where this cordon was just pruned a little bit ago, the same thing has occurred. There's approximately a hand width space between our spurs in our location. It's always advisable to wear some sort of eye protection, albeit sunglasses or some sort of eye protection, because you've got little things that could fly off of these canes as you're pulling them through the wires for eye protection. Some pruners like to wear gloves, especially if it's cold in the morning. They'll wear gloves, but in general, eye protection is mandatory. Where our 2 cordons come together from adjoining vines, we would like to leave a hand width or more between the 2 positions. And what I did is I cut off the end here and allowed it to still remain tied to the wire. experienced pruner can prune about 40-50 vines an hour depending on the vigor of the vine and what the type of work they need to do for them. And that's moving right along, removing the brush off the wires, making the cuts. This is a slightly older block of grapes in the same vineyard, and this is Merlot. And you can see the cordons are much more established. The spur locations are very well established as well. And one of the things when we prune these style of vines, knowing that Merlot clusters are fairly big, they need some sunlight to come in around the clusters, so we want to make sure that we have as much openness as possible between our spur locations. Sometimes they might be a little bit more than a hand width, depending, and sometimes they're a little bit close, but you can see we got some pretty nice spaces in here. And doesn't matter which style of cordon pruning you're going to do, whether it's a quadrilateral such as these or a bilateral, we're still going to remove approximately 95% of the current season's growth for this coming year. And what I mean by that is that these canes are all going to be cut down to 1 or 2 bud positions, and all of this foliage will be eliminated for this year. So that's approximately 95% of the current or past season's growth as green shoots that harden off to be cane. So that will be cut off for this year's production. So, and again, we're going to go to 1 and 2 bud spurs, and we want to try to maintain at least a hand between our positions. Removing off, and even though this was broken at harvest, it's still viable. There's still green here. These 2 buds are still viable. We're going to go ahead and leave that 1 bud because it's small. I'm going to cut this back to 1 bud on that shoot because it's very small. We cut this back to 1 bud because you can see it's got small diameter and it only grew about 1.5 feet. But we don't want to remove this whole position. We're just going to remove it and leave 1 bud again for it to come this year. This one here is the same thing, 1 bud. This we're going to try to make a new position in here. 2 buds. And again, our definition of buds is, here's a basal over here. This is our first full bud. This is our second bud, so that's 2 buds. This is going inward. Even though it's in the lower position, I'm still going to go ahead and allow it to be eliminated so we can have the more vertical position here. Same with this here. We generally want to delay our pruning plans until late January, early February, and continue into March. The reason being because for one is frost, or lack of frost protection if some of the vineyards do not have frost protection, and we can delay the coming of the buds. The second part is a fungal disease called Eutypa, and Eutypa spores early in the year, November, December, are more prevalent, especially with wind and rains, and can land on these big, larger cuts and infect the arms, which it creates dieback. By delaying our pruning, we don't have to treat with a product called B-Lock or Viticultural or anything on all these cuts. So we're trying to save our clients money by pruning as late as possible, and also to buy a little time into the frost protection period. And generally, so it'll take us a couple months to get through all the pruning, but this year, because we've had no rain delay days, we're actually moving along pretty well. This is a good example of last year. This is where a cluster hung, and here's where the second cluster hung. This is where a cluster was cut off with the grape knife, and here's position here, same as here and here. So you can imagine if these spurs are too close together and you have 4 clusters all taking up some space, and they're pretty good sized clusters, especially in Merlot. That's why it's really evident that we try to have really good distance between our spur locations. Because again, this is where a cluster was last October, and here was the other cluster. This was a position for a cluster, and one right here. So you can kind of see the architecture of why we need to have as much space between our spurs as possible, because we need to hang this fruit and get good ripening around the whole thing. You know, again, we can point them out continuously along here. So we would assume that each one of these 2 bud spurs is going to have 2 shoots and approximately 2 clusters per shoot. And that's how we're going for our crop. If the young shoots or the small shoots, a small caliber like this, these clusters were probably removed in August or September because we knew they were not going to make it for maturity. So they got cut off to allow whatever energy to go in this shoot at that time. And thus for, because it didn't make size or length, we're still going to cut it to 1 bud. And same thing over here. We know that this is pretty viable, so we're going to go 2 buds and 2 buds and 2 buds, and we have no choice here, so we're going to leave those as 2 buds. Now here, where there's actually a 3rd shoot coming out of this arm, it gives us an opportunity to actually lower this arm. So by doing that, we'll go ahead and leave that for 2 buds and reach across here. Again, using the flat side of my shears, I'm going to cut through there and remove that and lower it down, and hopefully next year this will be here. And here, because this is would be my best one here, looking at this next year will be the one that will come here. Because again, pruning is really for the future. The next year and the following years, how we leave our positions. I could leave this here very easily, knowing that this shoot will come over here and maybe create some problems, but it's not. If this arm was where the spur was more vertical, I would say this would not be the right decision or to leave this one. I'll repeat that. If this arm was going more straight up and down in this position where this would be too close, I would remove this and leave this, even though it's higher position, but I don't want to have all that competition too close together. But because this arm is now going outward more, I would still tend to want to leave this short, take this down, knowing that hopefully next year this is going to be the shoot or the cane that we're going to cut back to and remove this. So now we've brought this more upright. Here's an idea where the 2 bud spur, even though there's 2 shoots, there's actually a basal shoot that grew from the basal bud last year, as well as the first shoot. So the second bud did not emerge, so we'll cut that off because it did not grow. We don't need that. And we have an opportunity actually to cut this to here and take this off here, which we'll do. Same thing right here. This was basically a 1 bud spur. Now it's, even though they left the 2 shoots as suckering, it still did very well. That's a pretty good how this vine should be pruned and trained. You know, everything again is pretty equal distance between our spurs. There's a missing spur here and one that was cut here, but they were probably too close at one point. This one might have gotten sick and died. So this arm is now replacing that, and it's, you know, for the most part desirable because it's still going upright. And that's the key, is upright positions for wine grapes and equal or nice spacing between them, and not too close on our ends where they join.